Hello, welcome to Diving into the Wreck. There we go. I'm Geoff Gerrietts. I'm a development manager at AppNeta. I've been a Pythonista for 16 years and a developer for about 20. Over that period of time, I've been a manager, a DevOps engineer, a programmer, a webmaster, a technical writer. But before that, I studied English. I was going to be a poet. I like to make not really joking jokes about how writing poetry and programming are similar. I won't talk about that today, but I'd love to. The title of this talk is actually from a poem. First, having read the Book of Myths and loaded the camera and checked the edge of the knife blade, I put on the body armor of black rubber, the absurd flippers, the grave and awkward mask. So, the poem's by Adrienne Rich, who, when I studied it, was one of the most influential contemporary poets of the time. Now she has passed on and moved into the canon. I really like the poem, and it's what came to mind when I thought about this talk, because the power of the metaphor is salvage diving. It really captures reflection and analysis, the profound weight of the waters of time bearing down on us while we shine beams of light into tattered evidence. So let's shine some light into application performance. When we talk about performance, conversations often start with folk wisdom, like concatenate and minify your JavaScript and CSS files, and don't serve assets through your application, arrange to publish them separately, maybe even use a CDN. Throw money at the problem, because that's not just true in the web world, it works pretty much everywhere. In Python, there are some specific performance hacks that people recommend. A couple of examples, like joining lists rather than joining lists of strings rather than concatenating strings, which might be dated advice, but it's still pretty broadly parroted. Or maybe bind local names to prevent lookups, especially in tight loops. And no discussion of performance is complete without mentioning big O analysis, right? And none of this is wrong. It's all good advice. We should all be aware of what we're doing and making sure that we're choosing the right idioms. But it's all targeted at solving very specific problems, and most problems aren't those problems. My very first professional gig, I worked for a crusty old kernel developer who built Iliac. And he used to tell me that he hated hiring programmers straight out of school because in their third or fourth year, they would learn about performance and then they would be completely ruined for the next 5 or 6 years while they figured out how much it didn't matter. So let's think critically about performance, a little more analytically, right? So this is the architecture I use for all the sample code in this talk, which I promise we'll eventually get to. And it's a fairly typical architecture, though there are lots and lots of variations that you can see out in the world, okay? In this architecture, we have a couple of web server nodes with Nginx standing in front of Gunicorn and a Flask application server behind them. They both talk to a Postgres database that's running on a different machine, okay? Now, when we talk about performance, we talk about latency, and the latency that we care about is the time between us sending a request into these web nodes and getting the full response back and being able to see what happened, right? If that takes 100 milliseconds, which isn't bad, that 100 milliseconds accrues as the request traverses these various layers in the architecture and becomes a response. A key tool in understanding performance of applications is understanding where this latency comes from. And this is our razor right here, the thing we use to guide our suspicions and our investigations. I've seen them called the Jeff Dean numbers after a guy at Google who's apparently something of a wunderkind. But they really originate out of Berkeley. And at Berkeley, the site's linked in the slides. They have a little slider where you can adjust the year and see how these numbers change over time. Some of them don't change too much because they're bounded by the speed of light. Others change a lot because they're affected by Moore's law, right? So This yellow area here, Python sort of scribbles all over that. We're programming in Python, and our ability to really optimize in this area is fairly challenging. Python just doing a ton of stuff for us behind the scenes to make this all happen, right? But that's also where most of these optimization guidelines that we look at are really providing a lot of help. Now, for some applications, those optimizations help a lot, but not for most applications, and particularly not in the web domain. If we simplify these numbers, roughly, CPU is faster than memory, is faster than an SSD, is faster than a LAN, is faster than a disk, is faster than the internet, right? Knowing the magnitude on each of those little less thans, it does matter. Sometimes it's 4, and sometimes it's 100 times. But still, disk and network are the places where we incur the most latency. One last thing, and this is last year's talk, I'm not going to rehash it, but monitoring really matters a great deal, okay? I'll be showing a lot of trace view in this talk because that's what I work on, that's the tool that I build, but there are a lot of good choices for monitoring. There are a lot of ways to do it, a lot of ways to go about it. You don't have to use trace view, but I'm not trying to sell you trace view, but if you can't measure what's going on in your system, you're not going to be able to fix it. You're not going to know what's wrong. And if you do fix it by some random stroke of luck, you won't really know that you did. One last thing. Usually in these examples and in most real performance, it's almost always the database. We talked about how network and disk are the most expensive parts of of any transaction. And database has network and disk, and it does a whole bunch of CPU stuff as well. It's also the single bottleneck for almost all your requests. You've usually got one database that's supposed to handle everything for you. If performance analysis was a Victorian mystery novel, the butler would be named Postgres. Okay, so we've reviewed the book of myths. We've checked our knife and camera. Let's get wet, right? Application performance is pretty complicated, and when you start looking at it, you might get a view like this, or a view like this, or if you're really doing it all by hand, something like this. And these are not actionable views, right? Before you can really do performance analysis and troubleshooting, you actually have to identify the problem that you want to fix. I don't plan on spending a ton of time focusing on this, but with a view like this, which is similar to what a profiler would give you, or you could get through detailed log analysis, you can look at the frequency of a particular endpoint and its average duration and figure out sort of the total time that you're spending in any particular endpoint. That's usually a pretty good indicator of the problem spots in your application. A lot of times, though, you know the problem spot because that's why you're doing the performance analysis, is because something really sucks. All right, so now we move on to the shipwreck in a bottle collection. For our dives today, I have selected a handful of different wrecks. They're not the exact shipwrecks whose gunnels I jumped over as they sank, but instead dioramas that I've built for the purpose of this talk. All the code is available on GitHub. It's pretty terrible, so you might enjoy checking it out and laughing at me. The first wreck is the SS Truculent query, right? This is the most common performance problem that I see. It is, that's interesting. It is slow queries. This is what the site in question looks like. Interesting. Sorry, I'm a little surprised by what I have in my slides. This is the site. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And when you run it, that is really not a good response time, right? It's taken 14 and a half seconds for each page view. Now, averages can sometimes be deceiving. You might have some really, really slow stuff mixed in with some fairly fast stuff, and the averages are all skewed because of that. In this case, they're not, right? The graphs that I'm showing you, I have carefully curated them to show you exactly what we're talking about. When you go to try to figure out what's going on here, one thing you might try to do is look at at where latency is accruing by layer in your application. Which component is responsible for all the suck, right? And this graph shows that apportionment, and we can see pretty quickly that SQL Alchemy is spending a ton of time in each of these queries. A slow query log, since databases are usually our problem, is also a good resource for this kind of thing. And in this slow query log, we can see that that first query, which we ran 963 times, took an average of 14.3 seconds, which that's pretty close to our average response time. So we can guess that the query is the problem. Okay, so here's the code. It's kind of hard to see maybe, but can you see what's wrong with it? Can you see what's right with it? It's kind of bad everywhere in the highlight. It's using a subquery as its data source. And the subquery has a join in it. The subquery is really ugly. And then we add an unnecessary join on the outside where we've already joined this table, but we'll just join it again for fun. And then we have a like on an unindexed field. So this query is exaggeratedly bad, right? But typical incarnations of the slow query problem will do one or more of these things. Use unindexed fields, do elaborate, big, sprawling joins. Maybe they'll only take 1 second instead of 14, but almost always the solution to this problem is picking a better query or setting limits on the queries that you're making. So the second shipwreck we're going to look at is, I call it the SS highly selective. At one point I considered framing this as a murder mystery or a series of murder mysteries, and it was going to be death by 1,000 queries. So this is the site. It doesn't have to make sense. None of these make sense. I tried so hard to make the example programs make sense, but trying to make them make sense and also be terrible proved to be more than my match. So they just don't make much sense, but they are terrible. This one executes in about 4.2 seconds, which is better than our 14-second average in the previous example, but it's still not good, especially for stuff that's this policy light. These pages are pretty stripped down, right? So we look at a layer breakdown again, and we can see that holy cow, that is a lot of queries. We have more than 100 or almost 100 queries per call to WSGI. That's just a ton, right? And if we look at the slow query log, the slow query log shows us that burden is pretty much split across 2 queries, one for roles and one for players. Okay. This is what we call a trace and trace view. You can also use like a profile for this, or there are a number of other graph representations of transactions that you can use to look at what's going on in the lifespan of your query. Here we see that there's just a ton of red, and in particular, the red is SQL Alchemy, and we can see that there are 106 of those, which is probably excessive. If we look at the code, well, do you see the problem? Maybe? No? No? Maybe if we look at the template, huh? So what's going on here is that SQL Alchemy does lazy traversal of relationships. Django will do the same thing if you're using the ORM. It won't load the relationships for you in advance. And so every time we loop over the games, we grab a new game, and then we go and we grab all of the players for that game. So if you're processing a couple hundred games, you're going to do a bunch of follow-on queries to render this template, right? So there are a few ways that you can fix this, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about the solutions because I think solutions are very domain specific. They matter, like finding the problems is the hard part, and then solving the problems is really like relatively easy comparatively. When you're looking at a problem like this, you can usually fix it by eagerly joining the tables. but you might reconsider the scalability of the view you're trying to provide. There's another variation on this problem where when you have highly analyzed templates, where you've got like sub-blocks or whatever, frequently the methods that populate those sub-blocks will call the same queries. Like they might look for an organization name from the same table for the same user. And if you've got 30 or 40 of those templates all coming together in one page, then you've queried that table 30 times. And if you're not doing caching, you're gonna be sad. All right, so now we get to some of the more exotic wrecks. I guess these are like, I don't know, out in the Azores or something. This one's the SS Oryx-Antlerson. I named it for the neighbors, Judy's neighbors in Zootopia. They're the Oryx-Antlersons. They're going to be noisy, right? Yeah, all right. Anyway, I have kids, could you tell? This is the site in question. It's really simple. The idea is like you do a role for these games that I have not really defined. All right, so, and the performance here is actually pretty decent. It clocks in at under 30 milliseconds. But then at 3:35 in the afternoon, it grows by 150%. So sometimes looking at a heat map or a distribution of your responses will help. Here, everything's pretty tightly grouped. It's not some new endpoint that is bringing your average way up. It looks like the same traffic that you were doing before, but it is interesting to note here that after the break, the cluster is a lot looser, which suggests that something changed about the environment that this is running in. If we look at two of the profile views, then you can see that a view from before the poor performance and a view from after, we can see that the SQL Alchemy numbers for these, in the top, we spent a total of 18 milliseconds in SQL Alchemy, and in the bottom, a total of 53. So surprise, surprise, it's probably the database, right? And if we look at a CloudWatch graph for the CPU usage on your database, you can see that at about 3:35, it goes from a comfortable 20% to about 100%. So here's the code, and there's not really anything to see here. Don't beat yourself up if you can't find it. Nothing looks too suspicious because there's not really anything super suspicious. I mean, maybe you could look for something where it might be time sensitive or sensitive at the time of day, but no, in this case, something else is going on. So now we go ask the database, what is going on in you? And the database will tell us that this top block of stuff are all our connections from our web server. But then we have a number of other connections from this 172.31.61.237 machine, right? Who's that? So the slow query log, or rather the process log in your database, isn't always going to tell you by IP what's going on in your system. Sometimes you might need to look at the queries and trace those back to specific endpoints. Sometimes the right place to look is in Nginx logs across your architecture. But in this particular case, we were able to trace it back to a machine. And this is the culprit. It's that second web server from that very first diagram. And we can see that it's got a pretty remarkable response time. At 28.1 seconds, we can see it spins up at 3 minutes, or 3:35 p.m. And the code here might look a little familiar because it's pretty much the code from the very first example. Once it started up, it beat the snot out of the database, and nothing else could get any work done. All right. So yeah, fixing noisy neighbors is entirely domain dependent because somebody's beating your database up and you're just going to have to figure out how to get them to stop, right? Or maybe it's you and you need to fix the other endpoint. But it's interesting, I guess the interesting thing about the noisy neighbor is that the critical endpoints that you're monitoring, that you're paying very close attention to, may be where you find an indication of a performance problem, but the performance problem may originate somewhere else, somewhere where the performance is expected to be slow or or maybe isn't even that bad, but is locking up critical resources. All right, so the last one is possibly my most exotic, the SS Remembrance Lost, and I'm going to talk about memory fragmentation. This happens in a lot of different interpreted languages. Python and Ruby both have problems with it. It's getting better in Python, but it's still not gone. So this is the site. There's not really much very interesting about this particular site. Here's a graph of its performance, right, which is like kind of wild looking, right? There's more peaks and valleys than the Cascades. But what we see is that this green or the olive area is all Nginx, which is weird because you don't usually expect that Nginx is going to take very long, right? And if you believe this graph, requests are spending somewhere around 30 seconds just in Nginx. Also, we can see over here that throughput starts out really strong, but then it peters out. Weird, right? Okay, so here's a similar graph from a different test run with totally different characteristics, right? The only similarity is the weird spike in Nginx. So here's a clue. This graph matches our first test run, and we see that it starts out with a ton of errors, and then the request rate falls off, but the errors go away. In our second test run, we see errors throughout with one notable gap where Nginx spiked up to 30 seconds. Okay, so now we go look at web server logs, and what we see right away is, we have a memory problem, right? And memory problems are generally regarded with a significant amount of dread because they are notorious for being difficult to solve. But fortunately, this particular one isn't that bad. So the top graph here is from our first test, and we can see that the memory usage goes way up at the start of the run, and then it sort of flattens out into a nice long plateau. And in our second test, we can see that the memory profile pretty closely matches the request profile time, and that it's running real close to the top throughout. The bottom is from CloudWatch, and we can see that at one spot in there, CloudWatch just like, I don't know, and it's up and down quite a bit. The memory's topping out a few times. If we look in the kernel log for the web servers, we can see that there are things in here like the killer killing processes, segfaults killing processes. It's, in general, a pretty bad scene. So let's look at the code. The code itself doesn't look all that bad, I say, having written it, right? What's weird about this code, though, is when the count gets significantly large, it retrieves a large amount of data. And in Python, it allocates memory in this sort of, I'll call it a funny way. It's designed to increase performance, and it does a good job of increasing memory allocation performance, but it has a weird side effect. So this sort of grossly oversimplifies Python's memory management, but it'll get us through this talk. All right. So Python manages memory in a variety of pools. And I've drawn the same pool at 3 different points in its life cycle. At first, it's of modest size, and then it grows to accommodate new objects. Then those objects are collected, and we have these sort of empty sockets waiting for objects. Python does not shrink the pool at that point. It leaves the pool the same size that it was at peak, and it will only collect the pool when all of the objects go away. Okay. So if you watch this on top while it's running, like restart everything on the server, and you fire up top, and then you start firing some requests at it, we can see that the resident set size for each of these processes, when we trigger it with an argument of 8, it'll grow to take up 1.1% of available memory. Okay, when we hit it with a 512, though, it grows to, it shoots up real fast to like 19, and then it falls back to this 12.1%. Okay, if you've got 4 gigs of main memory and 10 unicorn workers, and each of those workers is holding on to half a gig, pretty soon you're going to run out of memory. And this is what's happening, is that each of the worker processes grows to be 488 megs, and then pretty soon one of them needs memory that's not there anymore. So there are a couple ways that you can fix a problem like this. This is a case where throwing hardware at the problem is definitely a decent solution. You can reduce the number of workers so that your maximum process size is expected to fit inside memory. And what most people do is they periodically just restart the process to flush those memory pools, which is a little heavyweight, but there you go. All right, so let's come back up for some air. Let's sort of review, right? The big things, the takeaways that I would like to give you here is when you start working on performance, don't go looking to improve performance. Instead, identify a problem, analyze that problem, and fix that problem. And don't agonize over individual optimizations. Instead, go look at the network, look at the database, and figure out if that's where your resources are. So that's it. The stuff's all out on GitHub. The slides are going to be available, and also they're on Google Slides, so you can get those. I don't know how much time we have left. Probably not too much. Yeah.
We have time for a few questions if anyone has them. Cool. I'll bring a microphone to you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really great. I have a question. You might have already told us this, but what's the software you use to create all the graphs that you showed?
So not all of them, but most of them were extracted from TraceView, which is the product I work on. Some of it came out of CloudWatch. The TraceView builds them using D3 and a whole lot of custom code. So, cool.
Anyone else I'm missing? All right. Well, that concludes this session. So it's break time. And if you hurry, maybe you can get some more raisins.